Aristotle and the Good Life. We have all our introductory sort of ideas of who is Aristotle. The Nicomachean Ethics, as it's called, a work on ethics by Aristotle. We don't know, it was either named after Nicomacheus, his father, or his son. That's all you need to know about that. It's just a dedication. It's addressing the Socratic question of how best we should live. It really would have been a series of lectures. We need to keep that in mind, that Aristotle is here really giving a series of lectures, and it's as if what we're reading is a note form of those lectures. And because of this, what we get is Aristotle's voice comes across as someone talking to a group of people and guiding them along, forcing them to ask questions and then answering or trying to answer those questions, then challenging those answers. You hear his voice as someone who is probably answering questions from the audience, answering objections as they arise. So with all of that in mind, let's get into it. Book 1 attempts to both define the subject matter that he's looking at, the question is, what is the good for man, and to justify his method. Don't forget, Aristotle is pretty much where we get our modern scientific method from. So as part of this investigation, Aristotle considers common opinions along with the opinion of poets and philosophers. He begins with the following. Every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action and pursuit, is thought to aim at some good, and for this reason the good has rightly been declared to be that to which all things aim. Key ideas here is that there is an end to which all things lead. We'll see some objections to that soon. The Greek term here is telos. Telos is the end of something, the function of something. He distinguishes also between some ends which are activities and some ends which are products. Very simply, you have a cooking is an end. The product of cooking might be the cake. Things that are products can, or that are activities, can also be themselves seen to be products, in the sense that a hierarchy this can lead to this, and then this leads to this. So cooking leads to a cake, but a cake leads to nutrition for the body. And this creates a hierarchy of ends. Those ends which lead to other ends are seen as subordinate to those other ends. What Aristotle is going to be looking for is the idea that there is an end to which all things lead, which he would regard as the good. First of all, he says, how are we going to do this investigation? And he looks at several ways of thinking about this. He concludes that the best science, keep in mind that the word science just means knowledge, so the best form of knowledge, the best, not theory of knowledge, the best practice of gaining knowledge is what he calls politics here. Don't get overly confused in terms of thinking about politics in a very modern sense of political parties fighting each other. What we're thinking about here is politics as in the science of the polis. The polis is the city-state, the people, the community. So how best do we organise our community? Why he looks at it in terms of the community is he sees a correlation between the cosmos, the community, the polis, and the individual. We get this in Socrates, with Socrates as well, in the Gorgias. particularly at the end of the part of the text that we read from the Gorgias, Socrates' argument for having an ordered mind. Socrates explains this by looking at the order of the universe. His argument is that it is sometimes easier to see things big than it is to see things small. It's easier to see the big picture, and then by seeing that you can realise what's going on in the small, because they correlate. So Socrates starts out by looking at chooses that the best science to study this, or what is the good for man, is politics. He recognises, though, that there are different views and that politics is a relatively imprecise science. It's a little bit like what I think it was Winston Churchill, who said that democracy is a flawed form of government, but it's the best we've got. It's the same thing here. Aristotle is a very pragmatic thinker. He's a very practical thinker. When he's considering something, he's not sort of thinking this would be just good to have as a thought. He wants to see it work in the real world. He realizes that the real world is made up of a variety of humans with lots of different tastes and desires and ambitions, and that because of this there's always slightly different opinions, and so you end up with the way we want to order a polis through the science of politics is imprecise. Right, let's get into it. This is the key. What is the good for man? Aristotle moves on, after having chosen his science to look at this, to observe that for the general run of people, the good is thought to be happiness. This term happiness is a very tricky term. It's tricky because it's so oversimple. In our day and age, we hear the word happy and we think of someone just smiling. Oh, I'm happy. We probably think of the song Happy. If I was good enough with technology, I'd cut a bit of that song in right now. But I'll leave that to the techo guys one day. It can end up feeling like what is sometimes called happyology, this idea that the way to live a good life is to walk around going, everything's okay, everything's happy, almost in a pathological daze. That's not what he means by happiness, and we need to unpack this word in a lot more detail. But he started off by saying, for the general run of people, it is regarded as happiness. Let's take it as happiness. Here, we might immediately accuse him of committing a fallacy. It is the fallacy of an appeal to popularity. Everyone thinks it's happiness, so it must be happiness. Let's move on. When assessing... This is the trouble with eating biscuits and doing a talk at the same time. I'll see what Batman says. When assessing our thinkers, we should be aware that we can simply say he could be accused of an appeal to popularity here. We don't need to do much more. We don't need to accuse him of that and get into an argument about whether or not he is doing this. We can just recognise that that is a possible weakness of the start of his argument. If the good is not happiness, then the rest of his argument basically becomes null and void. But for the sake of considering his argument, we're going to accept it with him and move on. So the actual term is eudaimonia. Eu means well, daimon or daemon as in demon, divinity or spirit. Well, spirit. Another translation here is flourishing. And that's a really helpful translation for us. Instead of just thinking about walking around with a big smile on our face, we have the idea that happiness, eudaimonia, is about achieving something, achieving our purpose, flourishing. The word evokes a plant life. It evokes, for example, an apple tree. When an apple tree flourishes, that's when the flowers arise. And the flowers, the flourishing of flowers, lead to the fruit, the apple. You might say that the purpose of an apple tree is to produce apples. And I don't just mean that for humans who like to eat apples or animals that like to eat apples, but for the tree, because the apples have the seed. The apples fall, they go into mulch, the seed grows new apples. The continuation of the apple tree. So flourishing is a really helpful way of understanding this term eudaimonia. Aristotle further identifies happiness with living well. He then observes that the popular view for living well is usually associated with achieving pleasure, wealth, and honour. Now, he is not doing the same thing as he did earlier. He's not committing an appeal to popularity here. He's recognising that this is what the popular opinion is. He then wants to assess it. He's not saying, this is the popular opinion, so we will accept it. Okay, so there's a distinction. First of all, he says there is a popular opinion that the good is happiness. Let's accept that. That we can criticise as possibly committing the fallacy to appeal to popularity. When he says there is a popular view that happiness arises out of pleasure, wealth, or honour, he then assesses it. So he's not requiring us to accept it. He's not committing a fallacy there. Let's look at these three types of life. He goes into a little bit more detail. He actually shifts around in his conversation and notes that there are three types of life. The life of pleasure, the political life, and the contemplative life. These don't correlate exactly with those three types of, or three ideas of what makes a good life: pleasure, wealth, and honour. During this discussion, he dismisses pleasure, defers contemplation. Later on in the text, not in our part of the text, he's actually going to come back and look at contemplation in a much more serious way and recognise it as a sort of fundamental to the good life. And he notes that men generally engage in politics for the sake of honour. Now, he does that, and then he sort of goes back to assessing pleasure, wealth, and honour. So, where is happiness to be found? In what is happiness to be found? He dismisses pleasure because it's also felt by animals. Okay. In this case, it's not unique to humans. He doesn't go into the idea that it's not unique to humans here. Later on in the text, he's going to focus on what is unique to humans as a way of trying to identify what is the function of a human, what is the function of man. Here he just sort of says that pleasure is felt by animals, and that as a measure of a good life would just be like treating humans as animals, and we're so much more, according to Aristotle. He dismisses wealth because it is subordinate, a subordinate end. You need wealth. It's not what you actually want. You want the wealth, you want the money to buy what you want. So the wealth is always an activity, so to speak, to a product. A means to an end. A means to an end. He dismisses wealth because it is a subordinate end. It, not is, that it is a subordinate end, not a final end, not desirable in itself, and never for the sake of something else. He dismisses honour because it can be taken away. People want honour. But honour is bestowed upon you by someone else. If it is bestowed upon you, it can be taken away. Therefore, honour by itself is not self-sufficient to guarantee a good life. It requires something, someone else. That little exploration of wealth, honour and pleasure, and the way he has dismissed them, leads him to a clearer understanding of what he thinks this good life must look like. So here he sort of says that after recognizing that there are intermediate or subordinate ends or goods, Aristotle sets out to identify the ultimate or chief good for man. He begins by identifying the three qualities of the chief good, and these have come out of that previous conversation. Since there are evidently more than one end, and we choose some of these for the sake of something else, clearly not all ends are final ends. But the chief good is evidently something final. We'll question that in a second. Therefore, if there is only one final end, this will be what we are seeking. And if there are more than one, the most final of these will be what we are seeking. This leads him to say that the chief good should be final. It should be the final end, not a subordinate end. It should be self-sufficient. It shouldn't need anything else for it to be. It should be desirable for its sake and never for the sake of something else. That's, I think, one of the summations in one of the textbooks. The way he puts it is, happiness then is something final, self-sufficient, and is the end of action. That's probably the quote you want to remember. Here, Aristotle can be criticised for committing the road to Rome fallacy. And simply put, just because all roads lead to an end does not mean that all roads lead to the same end. Maybe there is no chief good. Maybe there is no final good, final end to which all things lead. His argument is flawed. His argument doesn't lead us to need to accept that there is a final end. Recognizing that puts everything else he is about to look at, it undermines everything else he's about to look at. It weakens his eventual conclusions. So, I'm sorry for eating while I'm here. I've just had a long trip to come home, 2 hours. This is basically lunch at 6:30. So, okay, we're back. Aristotle then puts forward what has come to be known as the function argument. Having identified happiness as the chief good, Aristotle recognizes that we need to say what happiness actually is. It's all well and true to say, oh, the good is happiness, and happiness is the chief good, the final end of all things. It still doesn't tell us anything. So it's a quality to it, but it doesn't tell us what it actually is. He proceeds to say that for all things that have a function or an activity, the good or the well is thought to reside in their function. So when I play guitar, which I don't do very well, the measure of my playing is how well I achieve the function being guitar playing. The measure of how good this guitar is, it resides in how well it achieves its function. Its function is to produce sound. If it was a poor guitar that was out of tune, we would say that it wasn't achieving its function. However, the more it's in tune, the more it achieves its function, and the more we describe it as a good guitar. And the better I play, the more we describe my playing as good, or say that I play well. Which, by the way, I probably just play average. So, having recognised this leads Aristotle to suggest that if we can identify what the function is for a man, then we can find and identify what the good is for man. And what the good is what makes man happy. Therefore, to understand the good for man, we must identify the function, or ergon, the Greek term, of man. And with all these Greek terms, you don't need to know them for the exam. It doesn't hurt if you do know them and you know them well. You can put them in brackets like I've just done. This function must reside in something which is peculiar or specific to man. Criticism. We can level here. We can ask, why does the chief good have to be peculiar to man? This is what Aristotle says. Well, obviously, the function of man has to be something that is peculiar to man, or else it exists as the function for other things as well. Doesn't tell us anything about how to make man happy. Well, maybe what makes man happy is the same thing that makes animals happy. Dogs, cats. Maybe the function for man, animals, trees is life. In which case, why does it have to be peculiar to man? Life is a very good example of something that we could suggest as a function for man. This is another one of these occasions where we've got to ask the question, challenge Aristotle, recognise that this weakens his overall argument, and then accept his argument, accept where he's going, and move on. That phrase we use when we're writing about this is for the sake of the argument. For the sake of moving on, we will accept this point. Recognising it's weak because of this, we will accept it and move on. Another way of saying that is putting this criticism aside. Okay, so putting this criticism aside, the idea that the function of man must reside in something which is peculiar to man leads Aristotle to consider the nature of what it is to be a man. Okay, what is peculiar about man as distinct from animals, rocks, small fuzzy creatures, I don't know. He talks of this in terms of the soul of man. So Aristotle's idea of the soul of man, he recognises in our text three aspects to the soul, three parts of the soul. The nutritive soul, this is nourishment, growth, reproduction. The perceptive soul, sometimes called the passive intellect. This is the senses, feelings, perceptions, memory, desires. And then the rational soul, the active intellect. This is reasoning, thinking, calculating, judging, deciding, planning, knowing. All right? He recognises these, and then he can go through to see if any of these aspects are specific or peculiar to man. So he dismisses life because nutrition and growth also belong to plants. He dismisses perception because it's shared with animals. He identifies rationality as peculiar to man. Of course, this might be challenged by recognising that certain animals also seem to demonstrate rationality. For example, as year after year students bring up the example of dolphins, the example of elephants, for example. Elephants are known to have elephant graveyards. They appear to make choice about how they how they mourn their dead. Again, we've got to say that weakens his position, but putting that aside, Aristotle concludes that the function of man is to be a certain kind of life, and this is this to be an activity or actions of the soul implying a rational principle. Rationality, the term ratio implies this to this. When you have this or this, put it that way, you have a choice. You choose this or you choose this. Rationality, the key feature of rationality is the ability to choose. So the function of man is to live a life where you engage in the actions of the soul implying a rational principle. In other words, you live a life where you engage in choice. And the function of a good man is to be able to perform this choice correctly, to choose the right thing. Hence, the human good turns out to be an activity of the soul exhibiting excellence. The term he uses, which we translate as excellence, arete, also gets translated as virtue. So the human good turns out to be an activity of the soul. The human good turns out to be engaging in choice, rational choice, excellently. Engaging in choice in a way where you choose virtue. Or to put this another way, the choice you make is virtuous because it is excellent. It is correct choice. He focuses here, he highlights, I should say, that the chief good is an activity. Aristotle uses the example of competing in the Olympic Games to emphasize that happiness comes from virtuous activity. It cannot just be a state of mind. Otherwise, you could talk of someone as being virtuous when they're asleep. Just because someone knows something, knows which is the right choice, if they do not act upon it, it is not a virtuous. They are not virtuous. He then says that the life of virtue is a pleasurable life. Now, this is a very interesting sort of side tack that he takes here. Earlier on in our discussion, he dismissed pleasure. And the sort of pleasure he was dismissing then was a life aimed at satisfying desires. Satisfying those base, particularly if you want to get sort of take to the base level, the base desires are our desires that are associated with reproduction and life. So food and drink and sex. So food and drink keep this body alive. Sex keeps the species alive. So that was the early use of the word pleasure. But here he says that a virtuous life, a life based upon rational activity of the soul in accordance with excellence or virtue, will be itself pleasant or pleasurable. It's probably worthwhile in your own heads distinguishing between pleasant and pleasurable. He's using them interchangeably, but for you, it might even help you when you write about this to write an extra sentence just saying, I am going to distinguish between pleasant and pleasurable. So the distinction is this. Pleasure does not produce a good life. However, a good life will necessarily be pleasant. So earlier on he was dismissing pleasure as an end towards which we should work. Now he's saying that if we live a virtuous life, it will be pleasurable. But we're not living this way for the sake of the pleasure or the pleasantness. Happiness then is the best, noblest and most pleasant thing in the world. But then he goes on and says that happiness still needs external goods as well. For it is impossible or not easy to do noble acts without the proper equipment. So I'll leave you to read that little section there. It does feel like he ends up saying that the achievement of happiness requires certain what's the word I'm looking for? Certain type of life that comes down to pure chance or how the gods have blessed you. It feels like happiness is being reduced to a matter of chance. This is, of course, another criticism of his theory or his teaching. But here I think Aristotle is, again, just being practical, being honest, being pragmatic. He is recognizing that it is easier to make the right choice if you're not under pressure. It's easy. So if we take the choice of, do I steal this loaf of bread or not steal this loaf of bread? The rational principle should tell you that not stealing is the right thing to do. But if you're starving because of your situation, it's harder not to steal it. It's harder to make the right decision. Nevertheless, he maintains that the good life is not a matter of chance. It is always possible to make the right choice, even in the most trying circumstances. It's just harder. An example that you could suggest would be the case of Job in the Hebrew Scriptures. This takes us on to Book 2, Moral Virtue, How It Is Acquired.